Claire Whitmore had never misjudged a person in $1 million deal. Not once. She prided herself on the ability to walk into a room, take a single sweeping glance, and understand exactly who held power and who was simply filling a chair. It was a skill she had sharpened over 15 years of boardrooms and brutal negotiations, a skill she trusted the way other people trusted gravity. So when the elevator doors opened on the 48th floor of Whitmore Dynamics that Tuesday morning, and she stepped into a conference room crowded with the most important signatures in her company's history, she did what she always did. She read the room, she cataloged every face, every posture, every suit, and then she saw him, a man in a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, sitting in the corner, no assistant beside him, a worn canvas backpack resting against his chair leg, glancing at his watch with the quiet distraction of someone who had somewhere else to be. Claire looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away and thought the legal department is really lowering the bar. She had no way of knowing that in 40 minutes, when she finally turned to the last page of the most important contract of her year, the name printed in clean black letters would stop her cold. Daniel Hart, the man in the corner, the man she had not bothered to greet. The 48th floor of Whitmore Dynamics occupied an entire city block of sky. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling glass offered a view of Manhattan that lesser executives had been known to go quiet in front of, momentarily humbled by the scale of it. Claire was not one of those executives. She had long since stopped seeing the view. The conference table ran 20 feet down the center of the room, polished to a mirror finish surrounded by chairs in Italian leather. The catering team had arranged a precise spread of sparkling water, single-origin coffee, and small pastries that no one would eat, because no one in this room ate in meetings. The Nexus Cloud representatives had arrived early, 3 of them in charcoal and navy, each carrying the kind of slim leather portfolio that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Claire's own team had filed in behind her Ethan Moore, her chief of staff, quiet and efficient as always, Marcus Webb, her chief financial officer, who wore his ambition in the set of his jaw, and 4 senior directors whose names sometimes blurred together in her mind because she had not yet decided which of them would still be employed in 6 months. The Nexus Cloud deal was the largest partnership Whitmore Dynamics had pursued in its 12-year history. Nexus ran the AI infrastructure that underpinned data management for 47 Fortune 500 companies. Getting them into a formal alliance meant access to architecture that would take Claire's own team a decade to build from scratch. It meant market dominance. It meant that the competitors who had been nipping at her heels since last spring would find themselves suddenly irreversibly behind. This was not a meeting Claire intended to lose any ground in. She had reviewed the dossier on Nexus 3 times. She knew their revenue figures, their server footprint, their patent holdings. What she had not been given, what Ethan had not flagged, and what she had not thought to ask, was a photograph of the founder. His name was in the documents. His reputation was in the documents. Words like reclusive and notoriously private and rarely attends industry events were in the documents. But there was no face attached to those words. That omission, which had seemed entirely irrelevant at 7 o'clock that morning when she was reviewing the file over black coffee in her corner office, would matter more than she could have imagined. Ethan leaned toward her as the room settled and murmured, "I've heard the Nexus founder is extremely low profile. No one on our team has met him in person." Claire had smiled without looking up from her notes. "The truly powerful always know how to make an entrance," she said. She meant it as a compliment to whoever was about to walk through the door in the kind of suit that announced itself before its wearer spoke a word. She was already composing in the back of her mind how she would calibrate her opening warm enough to signal respect, confident enough to signal that Whitmore Dynamics was not a supplicant. She was ready. What she was not ready for was the man already in the room. Daniel Hart had arrived 11 minutes before Claire. He had taken a seat at the far end of the table, the position least associated with authority, the one closest to the door, the one that suggested someone who was not sure how long they needed to stay. He had declined the coffee when the catering assistant offered it and asked quietly for still water. He had taken a single sheet of paper from his backpack and placed it face down on the table in front of him. Then he had folded his hands and waited. He looked to anyone who bothered to observe him like a man who was good at waiting. Not the restless waiting of someone who is uncertain, but the still waiting of someone who simply has no interest in performing patience. When Claire entered and her gaze swept the room with its practiced efficiency and landed on him for that single dismissive second, he noticed. He always noticed. He said nothing. He was used to this. In the years since Nexus had grown from a piece of code he had written in a rented apartment at 2 a.m. into something that powered a significant portion of the global economy. He had sat in many rooms where people had underestimated him. He had learned somewhere along the way that being underestimated was often useful. It gave him time to think. He glanced at his phone not out of rudeness, but out of the reflex of a man who had a standing appointment at 3 o'clock every afternoon that he had not missed in 4 years. The screen showed the wallpaper he had set the previous Sunday, his daughter Lily laughing on a swing set in Central Park, her pigtails flying sideways, her face a picture of uncomplicated joy. He turned the phone face down and returned his attention to the room. Claire was beginning to speak. The years that had made Claire Whitmore into the woman sitting at the head of that table had not been kind in the conventional sense. They had been instructive. At 24, she had walked into her first serious finance role with a credential from Wharton and a certainty in her own intelligence that she still believed was entirely justified. What she had not anticipated was the specific texture of being a young woman in a room full of men who had already decided, before she opened her mouth, how much of what she said they would take seriously. She remembered with a precision that years had not softened the first board meeting she had attended, where a senior partner had interrupted her mid-sentence to repeat what she had just said in a slightly lower register to the room, and the room had nodded at him. She had gone home that evening and stood in her bathroom for a long time looking at herself in the mirror, not with grief, with calculation. She was figuring out what she needed to become. She had adapted. She had built the armor piece by piece, the tailored suits, the precise diction, the unflinching eye contact, the reputation for decisions that were always 3 steps ahead of the obvious. She had climbed because she was genuinely brilliant, and she had survived because she had understood earlier than most that in the world she was trying to operate in, perception was not separate from reality. It was reality. Appearance reflects competence, she had said once in an interview and meant every word of it. The statement had followed her. Some people quoted it admiringly, others critically. She had never walked it back. It was simply what she believed. A person who took care of the details of how they presented themselves was a person who took care of details. It was not complicated, what Claire had never fully examined. In the decade of relentless upward motion that had carried her from associate to director to chief executive was what that belief cost and who it cost it to. She had built her standard as armor against the people who had underestimated her. And then, without noticing the transition, she had begun applying that same standard to everyone she met. She walked the room through the partnership framework, moving through the slides with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed not just the material, but the performance of knowing the material. The numbers were tight. The projections were conservative in some places and aggressive in others, calibrated to suggest ambition held in check by rigor. Her team watched her with the focused attention of people who understood that their job in this moment was to look as confident as she did. The Nexus representatives listened with the polite attentiveness of people who had already done their own analysis and were waiting to see if Claire's matched it. And Daniel Hart, at his end of the table, listened in a different way entirely. He read the projections not as a presentation, but as a system, tracing the logic forward, identifying the assumptions, testing the stress points. His face remained neutral. He turned his single sheet of paper over and made a few small notes in handwriting so compact it was nearly illegible. He circled something. He did not speak. Claire reached the final slide. She looked up, satisfied. "I believe this positions both organizations for significant growth within the first 24 months, she said. Around the table, heads nodded. There was a scattering of appreciative murmurs. Marcus Webb allowed himself a small smile of barely contained relief. And then, from the far end of the table, in a voice that was unhurried and entirely without drama, "There's a structural problem with the Asia-Pacific rollout." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has broken the surface. Claire looked toward the voice. The man in the wrinkled shirt was looking down at his single sheet of paper, not at her. "If you deploy on the architecture described in Section 4, he said, you'll hit a data saturation threshold in the Asia-Pacific nodes in approximately 18 months. Not because the growth projections are wrong, because the infrastructure model assumes a linear scaling rate that doesn't hold at those volumes." He looked up then, not with the expression of someone who was pleased with himself, but with the expression of someone who was simply reporting what he saw. "Which division are you with?" Claire asked. Her voice was controlled, but something had shifted in it, a slight compression, the sound of someone buying time. "I'm not with a division," Daniel said. "I've just worked with similar systems." He turned his paper so that one of Whitmore's senior directors, a man named Frank Hollis, who had spent 12 years building data infrastructure before joining the company, could see what he had written. Frank studied it for 4 seconds. Then Frank's face changed. It was a subtle change, a slight blanching, a tightening around the eyes, but Claire had spent 15 years reading faces across tables, and she caught it immediately. "He's right," Frank said quietly. "This is right." Daniel did not gloat. He did not shift in his seat or adjust his posture or allow any visible satisfaction to register. He simply continued. The security framework in Section 7 had 3 gaps. He said not catastrophic individually, but in combination, they created a vulnerability window that a sophisticated adversary could exploit during a migration event. The financial modeling in Section 9 carried a currency exposure that wasn't visible at current exchange rates, but would become significant if the euro moved more than 4 points in either direction, which given current conditions was not a remote possibility. He laid these observations out the way an engineer describes a load-bearing wall, not as criticism, but as fact, with the calm certainty of someone who has looked at structures long enough to see which ones will hold and which ones will not. The CTO of one of the Nexus team members, a woman named Susan Park, who had flown in from San Francisco and who had been doing her own quiet calculations all morning, set down her pen and looked at Daniel with an expression that was somewhere between recognition and relief. Claire watched all of it. She watched Frank Hollis's expression. She watched Susan Park's. She watched the room recalibrate in real time around a person she had filed away as irrelevant. And for the first time that morning, she felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in a professional setting. She felt wrong-footed. She looked at Daniel Hart, really looked at him for the first time, and asked herself the question she should have asked at the start of the meeting. Who exactly is this person? The answer came 20 minutes later, in the most ordinary possible way. The structural issues Daniel had identified were documented, assigned to the relevant teams, incorporated into the revision schedule. The meeting moved to its conclusion. Papers were gathered. Portfolios were closed. Claire reached for the contract, the formal document that would be countersigned by both parties before the detailed work began, and turned to the signature page. The language was standard. The terms had been negotiated over 6 weeks. She had read this page twice already. But she had not until this moment fully registered the line printed beneath the Nexus Cloud signature block. Daniel Hart, founder and majority shareholder, Nexus Cloud Inc. She read it once. She read it again. The words did not rearrange themselves into something else. She looked up slowly, and across the table Daniel was capping his pen. He had already signed. He looked at her with an expression of quiet, uncomplicated patience, the look of a man who has been in this moment before and has made his peace with it. The room was very still. Next to her, Marcus Webb had gone very still. Frank Hollis, standing near the window, had his hand pressed flat against the glass as if he needed something solid. Somewhere to her left, she heard the soft sound of a pen hitting the table. Someone had genuinely fumbled it. She noticed in the sharp way you notice things when the ground has shifted under you. The details she had dismissed as irrelevant that morning, the canvas backpack leaning against his chair leg, well worn at the straps, the kind of object that has been carried daily for years. The button-down shirt clean and pressed, but without the architectural precision of a man who had someone else pressing it. The plain watch, the paper cup of water he had requested in a room full of imported coffee. None of it was an accident. She understood that now. It was simply the wardrobe of a person who had made a long time ago the decision that she was only beginning to arrive at, that the substance of a thing was the only part that mattered. The room held its collective breath, and Claire Whitmore, who had built an entire professional identity on never being caught without the right response, sat with the contract in her hands and felt the full weight of what she had done that morning settle over her like weather. She thought about the moment he had arrived, the wrinkled shirt, the worn backpack, the apology for being delayed because he had been dropping his daughter at school. She thought about the glance she had given him that single dismissive second, and the thought she had allowed herself legal department lowering the bar. She thought about how she had opened the meeting without asking who he was, without extending the courtesy she had extended automatically, and without thought to every suit in the room. She thought about Frank Hollis circling something in his notes while she presented, and about how Daniel had watched her slides with the quiet attention of someone reviewing work they already understood at a deeper level than the person presenting it. The conference room felt suddenly very large and very quiet. Claire set the contract down. She looked at Daniel hard across 20 feet of polished table. She stood up, and she walked the length of the room and extended her hand. "I owe you an apology," she said. It was not a performance. She had not rehearsed it. It came out plainly the way things come out when there is no version of them that sounds good enough and you say them anyway. Daniel stood and took her hand. His grip was firm and brief. "You don't," he said, "but I appreciate it." They did not go to lunch. Daniel had declined before she finished asking, and he had declined in the way of someone who is not being polite, who is simply telling the truth. "I have to pick up my daughter at 3 and he said. "I don't miss it." Claire had nodded, absorbing this, and then said before she could stop herself, "You pick her up yourself." It came out with a note of genuine surprise that she immediately recognized as revealing something unflattering about her assumptions, and she saw the faint flicker of recognition in Daniel's expression, not judgment, but acknowledgement. He had heard that particular surprise before in many different voices. He had stopped being bothered by it. "Her name is Lily," he said. "She's 8. Her mother passed away 4 years ago." He said it without the cautious performance that people sometimes applied, to loss the careful slowing of speech, the searching look to see how the listener was receiving the information. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, because it was true, and because there was no point in anything else. "I decided early on that I didn't want her to grow up remembering that her father was mostly somewhere else," he continued. "There are things I've said no to because of that decision. I don't regret any of them." Claire said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about her own schedule, about the back-to-back commitments that filled every day from 6 in the morning until 9 at night, about the weekends she had worked through for the past 3 years, about the family dinners she had stopped being invited to because she had declined too many times. She was thinking about what she had said yes to and what it had cost her, and whether she had ever calculated that cost the way she calculated everything else. "She sounds like a remarkable kid," Claire said finally. Daniel smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger, less contained, like a man who was only serious when the work required it. "She really is," he said. Then his phone lit up on the table and he glanced at it and said with quiet directness, "Excuse me, I promised I'd call during her lunch break." Claire stood in the empty conference room for a long time after the Nexus team had left. Ethan had lingered at the door, reading her expression, and then withdrawn without speaking, which was one of the things she valued most about him. She walked to the window that she had stopped seeing years ago and looked at the city below, the grid of streets, the motion of yellow cabs, the small dark shapes of people moving on the sidewalks 48 floors down. She thought about Daniel Hart writing code in a rented apartment. The file Ethan had pulled together after the meeting assembled in 15 minutes of quiet urgency while Claire sat at her desk with her coffee going cold, painted a picture she had been entirely unprepared for. Nexus Cloud had started not with venture capital or a high-profile launch, but with one person and a problem. The first version of the platform had been built entirely by Daniel in the 18 months following his wife's death. When Lily was 4 years old and asleep in the next room, and Daniel had worked through the nights because the work was the only thing that kept his mind from going somewhere it couldn't afford to go. He had turned down 3 acquisition offers that would have made him wealthy enough to stop worrying about money for several lifetimes. He had given the first round of equity to the engineers who had built alongside him at percentages that his own lawyers had argued against. He had declined every profile, every keynote invitation, every request to appear on the kind of panels where the subject is essentially the speaker's own brilliance. There were almost no photographs of him in circulation. Claire had searched and found two. One grainy image from a conference badge 5 years old, and one shot from a distance at what appeared to be a school event. In both of them, he was looking somewhere other than the camera. "He doesn't want to be a brand," Ethan had said, with something in his voice that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. "He just wants to build things." Claire had sat with that for a long time. She thought about what it meant to build something without wanting credit for the building. She had always assumed that ambition and visibility were the same thing, that the people who were genuinely driven would naturally want to be seen. She had modeled herself on that assumption. She had been visible in every room she entered, had made sure of it, had treated invisibility as failure. But Daniel had built one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the global technology ecosystem from a rented apartment in the months after the worst year of his life, and he had done it without a single photograph. She thought of herself in the window reflection, the precise cut of her jacket, the careful architecture of her expression. She thought of the women she had been before this version of herself had been constructed, and wondered how much of that person was still somewhere underneath all this polished surface. Daniel came back 4 days later. He hadn't planned to. The contract revision was supposed to be handled by the Nexus legal team, and Daniel had thought he was done with the 48th floor for the foreseeable future. But at 10 minutes past 2 on a Thursday afternoon, his phone rang with a problem that required his direct attention, a discrepancy in the data migration specifications that no one else was authorized to resolve, that would, if left unresolved, past close of business, trigger a breach of timeline clause with real financial consequences. He called the school. His regular backup, a retired neighbor named Helen, who had been their emergency solution for 4 years, was unavailable. The backup's backup was traveling. He stood in the lobby of his building for 90 seconds, running the calculation, and then he called Lily's school and told them he was coming early. When he walked into the Whitmore Dynamics lobby at 2:45, Lily was beside him, wearing her school backpack and holding a paperback book with a dragon on the cover. She was not visibly inconvenienced. She had spent sufficient time in her father's orbit to understand that sometimes plans changed and you brought your book. The receptionist looked at the pair of them with an expression that began as professional neutrality and ended as something much warmer. She called up to the 48th floor. Claire took the call herself. There was a pause. "Send them both up," she said. Claire was standing when the elevator opened. She was not sure why she had walked to the reception area instead of waiting in her office. It had been an impulse barely examined. She watched the doors open and saw Daniel still in a button-down shirt, and beside him, a girl who was immediately and obviously Lily. The resemblance was in the eyes, the same quality of steady attention, the same sense of a person who is fully present in whatever room they occupy. But Lily had something that Daniel kept carefully managed, an absolute unguarded openness. She looked at the 48th floor of Whitmore Dynamics with the alert curiosity of someone seeing something interesting for the first time, and then she looked at Claire with that same uncalculated directness and said, "Dad says you're the boss of the whole building." "I am," Claire said. "That must be really tiring," Lily said. Claire blinked. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "I like your jacket," Lily said, and then immediately lost interest and looked at the view. Daniel met Claire's eyes over his daughter's head. His expression said, "I apologize for nothing." Claire found that she was smiling, a real one, the kind that arrived without any of the performance she usually applied to professional interactions. She gave them the corner office with the best view, while Daniel worked through the migration specification with her technical team. Lily sat in Claire's own chair, a chair that cost more than some people's cars, with her dragon book open on her lap, occasionally looking up at the skyline with the comfortable sovereignty of a person who has been told they may touch something expensive and is entirely unbothered by the responsibility. At some point, Lily got up and came to find Claire in the meeting room adjacent. She stood in the doorway and waited until there was a pause in the conversation. Then she said, "Do you eat dinner with your family?" The question landed in a room that had gone silent around it. The two technical directors on Claire's team suddenly found things to look at on their laptops. Claire looked at the girl in the doorway, 8 years old, pigtails slightly loose from the school day, carrying a dragon book. Looking at Claire the way children look at adults when they are asking a real question and expect a real answer. "Not very often," Claire said. "That's sad," said Lily. Not unkindly, just as fact, the way her father stated facts. Then she went back to the corner office and her book. Claire sat for a moment in the aftermath of this. Across the table, one of her technical directors, a woman named Rebecca, who had 3 children under 10, and who had once quietly declined a promotion that would have required more travel, looked at Claire with an expression that was very carefully arranged into neutrality. Claire picked up her pen. She did not say anything, but something had settled in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water, and she knew it was going to stay there. The crisis came on a Monday, 3 weeks after the contract was signed. It arrived as crises tend to, without adequate warning, a data integrity flag at 2 in the morning that the overnight team initially misclassified as a routine anomaly, then correctly identified at 5:30 as something considerably more serious. By 7, there were indicators that an unauthorized access attempt had occurred during the weekend's scheduled maintenance window. By 8, when Claire arrived to find her executive team already assembled in the conference room with the specific stillness of people who are frightened the word breach was being used in some sentences and carefully avoided in others. The implications were not abstract. If the access attempt had succeeded, if any portion of the customer data held in the systems that Nexus was in the process of integrating had been exposed, the consequences would include regulatory scrutiny, potential liability, and the kind of press coverage that takes years to outlive. Whitmore Dynamics stock had already dropped 4 points on the pre-market. Marcus Webb had the look of a man doing mental arithmetic that was not producing comfortable results. Claire stood at the head of the table and felt the weight of it with a clarity that she had trained herself to remain functional under. Then her phone showed a message from a number she had not yet saved but recognized. It read, "I'm aware of the situation. I'm coming in. Tell your technical team not to isolate the migration partition until I've looked at it." She showed it to no one. She sent the instruction. Daniel arrived at 9:15 in the same worn backpack, and this time no one in any room looked at his shirt. He went directly to the server operations floor, which was 3 levels below the executive offices, and which Claire had visited exactly twice in her tenure as CEO, both times for ceremonial purposes. He pulled up a chair next to the lead infrastructure engineer, a young man named Trevor, who had been awake since 5:30, and looked at and began. He did not explain what he was doing, or seek permission to do it, or wait for anyone to formally acknowledge that he was the most qualified person in the building to do what needed to be done. He simply started working. He did not ask for a standing desk or a dedicated terminal or a quieter room. He worked from the chair he had taken with a cup of coffee. He had poured himself from the break room machine, the same institutional coffee that everyone on Trevor's team drank at the pace of people who are working too hard to taste what they're drinking. The engineers around him, who had spent the morning fielding calls from upstairs and managing the specific stress of a crisis that was above their pay grade but squarely within their responsibility, watched him for about 4 minutes and then quietly went back to their own screens. He did not need an audience. He was not performing crisis management. He was doing it. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon and the people around him. Trevor, then 2 others, then eventually a cluster of 5 engineers who had drifted in from adjacent teams, because word had traveled that something was happening, worked alongside him. He did not raise his voice. He did not make pronouncements. When he found the entry point, a gap in the handshake protocol that existed specifically in the window created by the Nexus integration, a gap that he had designed the original architecture to prevent, but that had been inadvertently opened during a patch applied 6 months before the deal was finalized, he said quietly, "Here it is," and explained what had happened with the same neutral directness he applied to everything. He fixed it. It took until 6 in the evening, and when he was done, Trevor's team ran the verification protocols 3 times in a row, and each time the results came back clean. Trevor, who was not given to visible emotion, put his head down on his desk for 3 seconds and then sat back up and said, "I need to change careers." Nobody laughed, because everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant. Claire came down to the server floor at 6:15 after the verification was complete. She stood in the doorway for a moment before Daniel noticed her. He was at Trevor's desk, drinking water from a paper cup, looking at the screen with the expression of someone reviewing finished work. Not the performance of satisfaction, but the genuine quiet of a person who has done what they came to do. He looked up. "It's contained," he said. The access attempt reached the outer layer of the migration partition, but didn't penetrate the core data store. Your customer data is intact. Claire nodded. Your exposure window was less than 6 hours and the entry point is now closed, he continued. Trevor's team did good work. They caught the flag correctly once they had enough information. He said this last part clearly in the room so that Trevor and his team could hear it. Trevor at his desk did not visibly react. But something in his posture changed the specific relaxation of a person who has been held responsible for something and has now heard from the person whose opinion matters that the outcome was not their failure. Claire watched this. She filed it. Later. After the security briefing, after the communication to affected partners, after the press statement that she and her communications team worked through until 9 in the evening, Claire sat alone in her office. The city outside had shifted from the gray of late afternoon into the full dark of night, and the lights were what she saw now, the same grid, the same scale, but in a different register. She thought about the server floor, about Daniel Hart sitting in a rolling chair next to a junior engineer working through a problem that was, not strictly speaking his problem to solve it, was a problem in Whitmore infrastructure arising from a gap in their own patch management, and solving it because it needed to be solved without calculation of credit or leverage or what it would cost him to give his expertise away. She thought about the engineers who had gathered around him, not because they were told to, but because they could feel the way you can always feel it, that this was a person who knew what he was doing. She thought about how different that feeling was from the feeling in a room where someone was performing competence, and she thought with a clarity that was uncomfortable about how many rooms she had been in where people were performing and how many of those rooms she herself had been performing in. She thought about the words she had been using in her own mind to describe the best kind of leader, and she realized that all the words she had been using were about projection, about how a leader appeared, about what they signaled. She had built her model of leadership on a theater of competence, and she had been very good at the theater. What she had watched on the server floor of her own company was not theater. It was the thing that theater was a substitute for. She opened her laptop and looked at the performance review framework she had been planning to send to her executive team. She read it through once. Then she opened a new document and began writing something different. She called Ethan at 9:30. He answered on the second ring because he always did. "Send flowers to Trevor's team in the morning," she said. "Something real, not corporate. Find out if any of them have been working through weekends consistently for the past month and get me a list." Ethan said he would. "And Ethan," she paused, "the performance review cycle starts next month. I want to change the framework. I want to stop measuring people against how they present in meetings and start measuring them against what actually happens when things go wrong." There was a brief silence on the line. "That's a significant change," Ethan said. "I know," said Claire. "Let's talk about it in the morning." 3 days after the crisis was resolved, the partnership numbers came in. The revised integration model incorporating the structural corrections Daniel had identified in the initial meeting had performed beyond even the adjusted projections. The data migration was clean. The security architecture was stronger than it had been before the breach attempt. 2 other companies that had been watching the Nexus Whitmore integration from a distance reached out to Claire's team, expressing interest in similar arrangements. The deal, which had looked at its worst moment like it might unravel spectacularly, had instead become a demonstration of exactly the kind of resilient partnership that neither company could have manufactured as a story. Claire sent Daniel a message. He replied within 2 minutes, which she had not expected. She had imagined him as someone who let messages sit. They met for coffee at a place he suggested near the school Lily attended at 8 in the morning, before the start of either of their days. He was already there when she arrived with a plain coffee and his phone face down on the table. Claire sat down across from him and said without preamble, "I was wrong about you. I judged you before you spoke a word, and I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry." He looked at her steadily. "It's all right," he said. It really isn't, she said, but I appreciate you saying so. She told him about the performance review framework she was changing, about the things she had started to notice in the weeks since the meeting when she walked her own building with different eyes, the people she passed in hallways she had not been registering as people, the junior analysts whose names she had not known, the team leads whose work she understood only in terms of outputs rather than the specifics of how they thought. I built something on the wrong foundation, she said. I thought I was measuring competence. I was measuring appearance. Daniel turned his coffee cup once. The world rewards that, he said, most of the time. I know, Claire said. That's the problem. He looked out the window for a moment. The street was filling with morning commuters, the particular density of a city beginning its day. People walking fast, looking at phones, carrying cups, moving with the purposeful urgency of people who have somewhere to be. There are a lot of people out there trying very hard to prove their value through what they look like, Daniel said. How they dress, what they drive, what their title is. They spend so much energy on the proof that they don't have anything left for the actual thing. He paused. I was never good at the proof part, so I just did the thing. Claire held her coffee with both hands. Did that make it harder? The not performing. She genuinely wanted to know. He thought about it, which she appreciated the fact that he considered the question rather than moving directly to an answer. In some rooms, yes, he said finally, but I decided early that the rooms where it mattered whether I had the right shoes weren't rooms I needed to be in. He picked up his coffee. The rooms where the actual work happens are different. He smiled, the full one, the one she had seen in the conference room when he talked about Lily. You have one of those rooms, by the way. You just didn't know it yet. He left at 8:45 because Lily had a 9 o'clock drop-off and he liked to walk her to the door. He said goodbye with a nod, no ceremony, the way people say goodbye when they are comfortable enough with each other to skip the performance of it. Claire sat with her coffee and watched him through the window, the canvas backpack, the unhurried pace, the way he stopped at the corner to hold the door for an elderly woman coming out of the building with a grocery bag. He didn't look back. He was already on to the next thing, already present somewhere else. There was something clarifying about watching a person who was not in any way posturing, who was not in any moment she had observed him doing anything for the effect of it. She thought about all the hours she had spent across 15 years constructing effects. The careful pause before a decision was announced. The way she entered a room, the way she dressed for a flight, in case she was seen at the airport by someone whose opinion she was maintaining. She had built an identity, and she had mistaken the identity for a self, and the mistake had been so total and so long-standing that she had not noticed it was a mistake. She had simply called it professionalism. She stayed for another 10 minutes. She thought about what she had built and what it had cost her, and what it could still be. The months that followed were not dramatic. Real change rarely is. It happened in small decisions made consistently over time, a different question asked in a meeting, a different thing noticed in a performance review, a different standard applied when evaluating who deserved to be heard. Claire restructured the promotion criteria for her senior team, removing the language around executive presence, a phrase she had used for years without fully examining what it meant and who it excluded, and replacing it with language about outcomes judgment and collaboration. She created a program for employees who were single parents, flexible scheduling, emergency backup care, coordination. The explicit acknowledgement that needing to leave at 3 o'clock to pick up a child was not a lesser form of commitment, but simply a different shape of one. She stopped holding the conference room on the 48th floor as the primary venue for meaningful decisions. She started holding working sessions on the server floor and the engineering bullpen in the places where the actual work was done by the people who actually did it. She started learning names, not just the names of directors and vice presidents, but the names of the overnight security team, the names of the data analysts who ate lunch at their desks, the name of the woman who managed the mailroom and who turned out, Claire discovered, to have a degree in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech and a side project in renewable energy systems that she worked on at weekends because no one had ever suggested she could apply it here. That woman, her name was Priya, and she was 31, and she had been managing the mailroom for 4 years, was by the following summer leading a sustainability initiative that would cut Whitmore Dynamics' energy costs by 12% annually. Claire thought about Daniel when she hired her. She thought about how many Prias she had walked past without seeing them in the years before the morning she had spent 48 seconds deciding that the man in the wrinkled shirt was not worth knowing. Ethan, who had been her chief of staff for 7 years, told her once during a late afternoon check-in that the building felt different. Different how beno, she asked. He thought about it. Lighter, he said, like people aren't as afraid. She sat with that for a while. In a hiring process, the following spring, a candidate arrived for a senior data architecture role in a blazer that had seen better days carrying a regular backpack, who apologized mildly for being slightly late because of a transit delay. 2 of the directors on the interview panel noted afterward that the candidate's presentation had been informal. One of them used the word unpolished. Claire reviewed the candidate's technical assessment, which was exceptional precise in exactly the ways that mattered and unimpressed with itself in exactly the ways that mattered more, and scheduled a second interview. She did not share her reasoning with the directors, not yet. She waited to see what they would see, given more time and less snap judgment. The second interview ran long because the candidate kept asking questions. Not the performed questions of someone trying to appear interested, but real questions about infrastructure decisions the team had made 3 years earlier. The kind of questions that suggested she had read everything available and wanted to understand the reasoning behind it. When the panel reconvened, the director who had used the word unpolished was quiet for a moment before saying, "She's actually extraordinary." Claire nodded. "Yes," she said, "she is." In the hiring discussion, when the other director mentioned again that the candidate's style had seemed casual for a senior role, Claire looked at him across the table and said quietly, "Let's hear about the work." The director nodded and moved on. The candidate was offered the position. On her first week, she had already identified an efficiency gap in the primary data pipeline that had existed unnoticed for 2 years. A photograph arrived on Claire's phone one Saturday morning in October, sent from a number she had saved under D. Hart. It was a picture taken in a park, golden light, fallen leaves, the particular warmth of a day that is giving its last generosity before winter. Lily was in the center of the frame, caught mid-spin in a yellow coat, her arms out, her face lifted toward something above the frame that was making her laugh. Daniel was at the edge of the shot, half-turned, watching her. He was wearing. Claire noted a flannel shirt, no jacket. He looked entirely at ease. The message beneath the photo said, "Only. Hope your week was a good one." She set the phone down and looked out the window of her apartment, a window she rarely sat at in a city she rarely just looked at. The skyline was there, the same geometry it had always been, but the light that morning was doing something particular to it, making it look for a moment less like a demonstration of power and more like something that had simply been built by people who were trying to build something good. She typed back, "Better than most. Thank you for the photo." She paused, then added, "Tell Lily the yellow coat is perfect." She put her phone in her pocket and went to make breakfast slowly for once, without an agenda, without anything waiting. She stood at the window while the coffee brewed and thought about the morning of the contract, about the 48-floor conference room and the 20-foot table and the man in the corner with the worn backpack who she had decided in the time it takes to draw a breath did not matter. She thought about the version of herself who had made that decision so easily, so automatically, with such total confidence in her own ability to read a room. That woman had been right about almost everything and wrong about the thing that turned out to matter most. She was grateful now for the contract, for the name on the last page, for the specific mercy of being wrong in a room where the consequences could still be reversed. Outside, the city moved at its ordinary pace, indifferent and alive, and for the first time in longer than she could calculate, Claire. Whitmore did not feel the need to be anywhere other than exactly where she was. The work would be there on Monday, the meetings would be there, the contracts and the decisions and the long, demanding days would all be there. But this, the light on the city, the smell of coffee, the photograph on her phone of a girl spinning in autumn leaves with her arms spread wide. This was also real. This counted. She had spent 15 years building a life she could point to as evidence of success, and she was only now beginning to understand that success and evidence were not the same thing. That the most important parts of a life are not the parts that appear on a contract. That the signature at the bottom of a document tells you very little about the person who signed it and everything about whether you bothered to ask.